Not having a go at people with swords. This doesn't even make any sense. She'd die. She would lay down her life for her people. She sure would in the first pissing sword fight that she had. It is impossible to underestimate the importance of strength, weight, and size in a sword fight.
Tell me you've never touched a weapon or a woman without saying you've never touched a weapon or a woman. Have you ever noticed that the world is full of Denethors who all think they're Aragorns? Weird, huh? Hey, well met, travelers. I've been searching for a sparring partner, not for boxing or sword fighting, which are my usual things, but for rhetoric. And travelers, I have found my Wario. Today, I'll be responding to a video by Disparu called "The Truth Behind Lord of the Rings Desecration." And unlike most Chud videos that complain about Rings of Power, this bit of content is actually informative and useful, not because it makes any valid points against the show, it does not, but because it opens a window into the philosophical framework that informs the entire project of anti-fan content creation. As you will be able to tell when he starts talking, Disparu here fancies himself an intellectual giant, a pop culture philosopher of sorts, who has drilled down into the moral and theological bedrock of popular franchises like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, and uncovered the deep, universal truths essential to telling good stories within them, and has in the process also discovered that Hollywood has an evil agenda to undermine those truths and, I guess, turn the men of the West into quivering soy jacks with their propaganda or something. Anyway, I've linked the full video down in the description because I am not going to go through it sentence by sentence. Instead, I've watched it multiple times and made notes about some recurring themes and claims that I think are worth addressing with some substance. I'll be playing clips from it here, but they will be out of order, so I'd encourage you to go watch the full video first, if you can stomach it, to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting Disparu or taking anything out of context. Now, Disparu here's channel blew up when he started making anti-fan videos about Rings of Power around 2 years ago, even though in the earliest video about it that's on his channel, he admitted that he had not read the books.
And I was watching from the side, not because I'm a massive Lord of the Rings fan, I'm a total normie, I've just seen the movies. I will be reading the books for when the series comes out though, just so I can accurately give a proper representation of it. Something that the writers of this show probably should have done as well.
Now it's been 2 years, so I will extend him the benefit of the doubt and assume he has read at least The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings since then. But I don't think he really understood them very well. And it's obvious that he has not yet read the rest of the Legendarium, or any of the supplemental material like Tolkien's letters. It's also pretty clear that Disparu here is just a damn liar. And that's the part I want to start with. Disparu does not just attack Rings of Power in this video, he also spends a significant portion of it mocking and trashing the upcoming animated movie The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. He frames War of the Rohirrim in the same way that he frames Rings of Power, as a travesty of feminized identity politics being forced into a franchise where it has no place, and is, in fact, an insult to the intrinsic morality of the original work. The main way he does this is by contrasting War of the Rohirrim with Peter Jackson's movie trilogy, which Disparu holds up as a flawlessly faithful adaptation of Tolkien's work and its core themes. The narrative here is that War of the Rohirrim sacrifices Tolkien's original story centered around masculine virtues for one that elevates an unnamed female character because the creators of the movie are agents of Hollywood's corrupt moral crusade and want to make everything about themselves.
Rings of Power isn't even the only property which is falling foul for the same ideas. That without Tolkien or living a life similar to Tolkien, just being trapped in the Hollywood bubble surrounded by effeminate lunatics, it means that they can't just not comprehend Tolkien's worldview, but their entire worldview is directly contradictory to it, rather than the men being the heroes and the builders and the saviors, rather than their values and moral system being the one which needs to be at the forefront of any heroic story. You end up with Hollywood's morality replacing it. And they value very different people. You end up with War of the Rohirrim, when they had the pick of Tolkien's appendices, and well, you know, we could have taken Helm Hammerhand, the story of the most powerful king in Rohan's history. Well, that sounds like a winning idea right there. Someone who defeated his enemies with bare fists. That would look great in an anime. Helm has a daughter, and we know she was central to the conflict that happened. Yeah, she probably caused it. And myself, especially screenwriter Phoebe, well, they were drawn to her.
I see myself in her, and I can't see myself in these dangly bits, and that means
I'm important. We could feel the weight of being that unnamed daughter who was completely pointless, which immediately piqued our interest. Who was she? How did she live? She's headstrong and insufferable, rides horses and communes with great eagles. At no point did they think to themselves, the most useful aspect of her in this kind of world, this civilization, would be by conducting diplomacy on her back. She will need to lead her people and call on the power of a seemingly long-lost tribe of female warriors. What a selfish cow. Now we have an exceptionally great antagonist in this story. Because we can have a villain who's a bloke, he speaks so directly to a lot of the crisis we're facing today, because that's exactly what you want in your story, isn't it? But it just goes to show the creators of this show, the creators of War of the Rohirrim, they share nothing in common with Tolkien at all. None of this was about, well, what would Tolkien would wanted the stories to go? No, this was just Phoebe was drawn to her.
I can put myself in that character.
It has to be about me. Hardly the entertaining story of self-sacrifice, duty, and bravery, is it? No, instead, it's all about me. I'm the one that matters.
Now, those of you watching this video, and not just listening to it, may have already spotted the bait and switch here. Keeping the dichotomy Disparu constructed in mind, between the Lord of the Rings film trilogy being the product of the creator's fidelity to Tolkien on the one hand, and War of the Rohirrim being a product of corrupt Hollywood morals on the other, take a closer look at the names in the Entertainment Weekly article he's reading from. The quote he's mocking is attributed to someone identified as Boyens. Turns out that's Philippa Boyens. You know, the same Philippa Boyens who co-wrote the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy with Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh. And Phoebe Gittins, the co-screenwriter of War of the Rohirrim, is Boyens' daughter. Philippa Boyens is serving as a producer on War of the Rohirrim, and what's more, Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh are executive producers on the project. To a significant degree, this movie is a product of the same creative minds who brought us the Lord of the Rings movie trilogy. And rather than trust in a team that has already proven they're capable of making a terrific Tolkien adaptation, Disparu pretends that the two projects have nothing to do with each other because it serves his political narrative to deny it. And he actively obscures the fact from his viewers by drawing their attention away from who Boyens is and away from the fact that War of the Rohirrim is being made with Peter Jackson's active involvement. There's only one way to describe that, folks. Disparu is lying, and he knows he's lying. So much for those masculine Christian values he elevates. Now, Disparu's main gripe against War of the Rohirrim is that they chose to elevate and center an obscure woman character from Tolkien's lore rather than focus on a man, like the original did. But this really shouldn't have surprised him, given the involvement of Jackson and Boyens, because this kind of thing was all over Jackson's adaptations. They completely changed the motivation of Éowyn and expanded her role in the story to make her a heroic, inspirational warrior woman figure, which she was not in the books. They also elevated Arwen from barely more than a footnote in Tolkien's books to become a badass girl boss who usurps the role of a male elf with an epic quest. #Justice for Glorfindel. And that was just in the first movie trilogy. Let's not get started on Tauriel from the Hobbit movies. The fact is, Peter Jackson made huge changes to Tolkien's lore for his movie adaptations, and Disparu is oddly willing to grandfather those changes into his weird culture war shadow play. Which brings us to the next big theme in Disparu's video. Disparu's reverence for the Jackson movie trilogy does a lot of heavy lifting in this video. He wrangles it not only to mock War of the Rohirrim and Rings of Power, but also, and mainly, to bolster his deeper thesis that Hollywood degeneracy is ruining traditional storytelling. He argues that Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy is better than Rings of Power or War of the Rohirrim because it's a faithful adaptation that retains Tolkien's moral and religious framework rather than replacing it with that of modern filmmakers.
You can take Lord of the Rings and break it down into its fundamental ideas, values, and morals. You can say that Tolkien was Catholic and so it's in the story itself. You could even remove that from Lord of the Rings. But the moment you do, because it's the foundation, everything else collapses.
We should take what Tolkien cared about, clearly, we should take those and we should put them into the film.
You can't pick and choose parts of a product and change them just because you don't like them personally without destroying everything, because quite frankly, these people are too thick to understand the knock-on consequences. That's if you believe they can even comprehend morals in the first place, rather than simply a never-ending thirst for power. But this is why Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings will probably be the last good adaptation there is, because he seemed to understand Tolkien's values and had the intention to keep them where they were in there. People can complain that certain bits were cut out. Oh, we didn't put Tom Bombadil in, but they were kind of stones on the pyramid that might be nice to have to keep it in that shape, rather than fundamental aspects of the creation. The issue is, in Rings of Power, you don't have that.
But how true is this? It's worth reminding Disparu at this point that Christopher Tolkien hated Jackson's movies. Like, really, really hated them a lot. He felt the Jackson movies stripped the story of his father's religious themes and reduced it to a mere adventure tale. In a 2012 interview with the French news service Le Monde, Christopher Tolkien said, quote, "The chasm between the beauty and seriousness of the work and what it has become has overwhelmed me. The commercialization has reduced the aesthetic and philosophical impact of the creation to nothing. There is only one solution for me: to turn my head away. They eviscerated the book by making it an action movie for young people aged 15 to 25. Unquote. Christopher hated these movies so much that he filed a lawsuit against Warner Brothers after they started making ancillary content like video games, in the hope of regaining creative control. Because, you see, Peter Jackson did not obtain the film rights to Lord of the Rings from the Tolkien estate. He got them from a company who purchased them from J.R.R. Tolkien in 1969. The film rights changed hands several times in the intervening years, and the Tolkien family had no input at all into the content of Peter Jackson's movies. The Tolkien estate settled out of court in 2017 and immediately began taking pitches for a TV or streaming series based on The Lord of the Rings. They approached Amazon, HBO, and Netflix, who all gave pitches to the estate. You can probably see where this is going. Amazon's pitch, a serialized adaptation of The Second Age, won out, and the estate entered into a creative rights agreement with them, which is how we got The Rings of Power, a show in which the Tolkien estate has a great deal of input. So who is really the guardian of Tolkien's vision here? Well, that's not for me to decide. I happen to love both Jackson's movies and The Rings of Power. But Disparu's notion that Jackson's adaptation is more faithful to Tolkien's worldview, while Rings of Power is the product of degenerate Hollywood morality, is kind of undermined by which side of this argument the Tolkien family itself stands. Now, for what it's worth, I happen to think Chris Tolkien was way too harsh in his assessment of Peter Jackson's movies. They are more than just action movies, and they do intersect with some of Tolkien's core themes in a lot of ways. But I do see where Christopher Tolkien was coming from, because the changes that Jackson made are bigger than just leaving out certain characters or events from the books. A lot of Jackson's creative decisions fundamentally changed the thematic thrust of Tolkien's story, and it's pretty weird that Tolkien Understander-in-Chief Disparu hasn't noticed this. Just take the climax of The Return of the King. In both versions, the One Ring gets destroyed when Gollum falls into the lava of Mount Doom. But the cause of Gollum's fall is drastically different between book and film. In the movie, of course, Gollum falls into the lava because Frodo attacks him. They wrestle for control of the One Ring, and they both fall over the edge. In the book, that fight does not happen. Instead, Gollum dances a little jig of celebration along the cliff's edge and loses his footing. He falls into the lava all by himself. Or does he? Jackson's decision to change the cause from Gollum having an oopsie to Frodo dragging them both over the edge was made for cinematic reasons. It's simply a more visually dynamic and satisfying on-screen end to the One Ring. But it also shifted the agency of the One Ring's destruction away from Tolkien's intent of it being divine providence at work to it being the work of a mere mortal. At the most climactic moment of this story, Peter Jackson completely stripped out Tolkien's Catholic religious beliefs and replaced them with his own artistic vision. And it works. Very few people would argue that Jackson's The Return of the King was a bad movie. It did win multiple Academy Awards, after all, including Best Picture. But according to Disparu's logic, this fundamental change, this stripping out of Tolkien's fundamentally Catholic religious worldview, should have caused Jackson's entire movie to fall apart. And yet, it didn't. Weird, huh? So explain this to me, Disparu. If Tolkien's traditional Catholic worldview was so fundamental to The Lord of the Rings that removing it should cause the entire adaptation to fall apart, why doesn't Peter Jackson's trilogy collapse under the weight of its own Hollywood degeneracy? That's a rhetorical question, in case you were wondering. Disparu can't explain this contradiction because there is no contradiction. Disparu is just too high on the scent of his own flatulence to actually understand either morality or storytelling. And to further illustrate this, we need to talk about orcs. The volume of whinging produced by anti-fans over the pop culture rehabilitation of orcs is one of the silliest things that I have ever seen, at least on the surface. But Disparu goes a bit more mask off than the typical D&D grognard or Tolkien graybeard. He links the shift in the broader media portrayal of orcs to his grand unified theory of Hollywood degeneracy. It's not simply that audiences and gamers find orcs interesting and would like to explore them as a concept further. No. It's the result of a sinister program of cultural engineering that's directly and purposefully attacking traditional morality and traditional storytelling, which Disparu seems to think requires the existence of inherently evil races of people whom heroes can slaughter without moral consequence. He's convinced that this recent cultural development grows out of a moral worldview that's fundamentally at odds with that of J.R.R. Tolkien.
Without Peter Jackson maintaining those values, you would have ended up with very different movies.
This should ultimately be Tolkien's film, it shouldn't be ours.
And we could even see what those changes would have looked like in other properties. We saw how D&D ruined orcs and turned them into whatever this is. And this new breed of writer in Hollywood, they can't put themselves in Tolkien's place. They can't comprehend his worldview. And if they can, they tend to think it's evil. Just like they thought it was in D&D, that it needed to be changed. That we have to go to every property and change it, after we've broken Dungeons and Dragons. Because they can't see the property from the worldview of the creators. They can't even understand their point of view to begin with. They begin finding problems from their perspective, using a different reality, which the system was never designed to reflect, and changing it breaks the entire product to begin with.
And by this point, it will probably not surprise you to learn that Disparu is just full of shit here. He doesn't understand Tolkien's morality, or morality in general, at all, nor does he understand Tolkien's religious worldview. At all. Any Tolkien nerd worth their lambus bread can tell you that Tolkien himself was uneasy with the way he had treated orcs in his published stories. On the pages of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings read in isolation, orcs are written as basically inherently evil catapult fodder whom the heroes slaughter with impunity. Except, not really, because Tolkien made a choice in their depiction that troubled him for most of the rest of his life. The choice was this. Tolkien gave orcs the power of speech. Now, this was a theological and moral quandary for Tolkien as a devout and thoughtful Catholic, because if the orcs had the power of speech, it meant, in Tolkien's religious worldview, that they were sentient and sapient creatures with immortal souls, and therefore, they could not be intrinsically evil. As a traditional Catholic, well-versed in the Church's theology, Tolkien believed, in the words of Elrond in Book 2, Chapter 2 of the Fellowship of the Ring, that nothing is evil in the beginning. Not even Sauron was so. In Catholic theology, evil cannot make, it can only mock. Orcs, therefore, could not have been created by an intrinsically evil being or have been created wholly evil in themselves. They were capable of reasoning about their own lives and portrayed as having a moral sense of fairness even if they weren't capable of living by it. The orcs must have once been something else, something not intrinsically evil, who became corrupted after their creation. And this meant, according to Tolkien's morality, that killing them without regard must itself have been an evil act, and yet he often portrayed his heroes as doing precisely that. But don't take my word for it. Here's just one thing that Tolkien wrote about the nature of orcs from Morgoth's Ring. But even before this wickedness of Morgoth was suspected, the wise in the elder days taught always that the orcs were not made by Melkor, and therefore were not, in their origin, evil. They might have become irredeemable, at least by elves and men, but they remained within the law. That is, that though of necessity being the fingers of the hand of Morgoth, they must be fought with the utmost severity. They must not be dealt with in their own terms of cruelty and treachery. Captives must not be tormented, not even to discover information for the defense of the homes of elves and men. If any orcs surrendered and asked for mercy, they must be granted it, even at a cost. This was the teaching of the wise, though in the horror of the war it was not always heeded. It is true, of course, that Morgoth held the orcs in dire thraldom, for in their corruption they had lost almost all possibility of resisting the domination of his will. So great indeed did its pressure upon them become ere Angband fell that, if he turned his thought towards them, they were conscious of his eye wherever they might be." Unquote. In other words, orcs, in Tolkien's morality, were not intrinsically evil and were deserving of compassion and mercy wherever and whenever possible. They were also being oppressed by Morgoth and later by Sauron. Like many aspects of his work, this is an element that Tolkien fiddled with in his notes and letters for many years after the publication of The Lord of the Rings. He was constantly in search of a solution for the moral problem he had written himself into with his depiction of the orcs in his novels. He proposed many possible origins for the orcs within his legendarium, one of which, in the Silmarillion, was that they were originally elves of the East who had been corrupted by Morgoth, and as such, they were entitled to mercy whenever possible. And this, by the way, is the origin story that Rings of Power chose to use in their continuity. And that choice produced one of the most interesting new characters in the show, the corrupted elf Adar. Everything about that character, his motivations, and the show's treatment of orcs overall is downstream of that creative choice, rooted directly in Tolkien's own written speculations about the nature of the orcs, and reflecting both Tolkien's morality and Tolkien's religious beliefs. The fact that Disparu doesn't make these connections in his own videos tells me, and should tell you, either that he hasn't actually read Tolkien, or if he did, he'd fail to understand Tolkien, or, and this is the simplest explanation, that Disparu is lying about all of this. You be the judge. Now this leaves us with the root of the problem. Disparu's actually done the world a favor here by speaking aloud and laying bare the animating philosophy behind most anti-fan content. It's not just nitpicking, or just a strong preference for a particular interpretation, or even ego or superiority complex. Those things are probably operative in a lot of this kind of content, but they are not what drives it. Anti-fan content is a political project animated by adherents to a reactionary worldview that Disparu calls masculine Christian values. This kind of content is not simply making critiques or analyses of popular franchises, it is advancing an ideological agenda against an imagined ideological enemy.
Is it that you're impossible to put yourself into somebody else's shoes who has different values than you? Or is it that you don't understand the values of Lord of the Rings in the first place? Which, considering Hollywood at the moment, would be understandable, given that Lord of the Rings is the epitome of masculine Christian values. That's what defines all of good and evil in that series. Now, Hollywood only hires people who have a singular belief system, and that belief system revolves around being weak and a victim. It praises people who have never achieved anything. It thinks it's a bonus, specifically because we have to raise up the people who can't achieve anything. Under the new system, being a failure is actually a virtue, because under their beliefs, it's not your fault you're a failure. No, obviously you were persecuted, and that means we're the ones who have to give you this $180 million show. But the issue with only hiring the weak, the vulnerable, and the failure, these people will never have overcome darkness, challenge, or struggle. The virtue is in fighting the problem, overcoming it, not surrendering to it. But most of all, it's because Hollywood has gone through a change in moral systems. They've moved away from the masculine ideals of honor, duty, responsibility, and accountability, self-sacrifice, planting a tree of which you will never know its shade. And they've moved towards a new moral system, which all revolves around identity and power, how everything must be equal, and we'll make it that way. One that isn't just, you don't get what you deserve. It looks at somebody, goes, you're a failure, therefore we need to give you an opportunity because you were clearly oppressed. Clearly not your fault you were a failure. It can't be down to your actions. Somebody else must have been persecuting you. This belief system can never create heroes. It can only provide undeserved, unearned power to unbelievable people. And no one will ever get immersed in that story. They'll be repulsed by it because what you're essentially pushing, it's unfair, it's unjust, and the audience instinctually turns away from it. Because if you have to be strong to be a hero, and Hollywood only praises the weak, it seems the only way to get good heroic stories back in Hollywood is to entirely change the people which are inside it itself. And can you just imagine the headlines that would come from that?
Now, I don't know about you, but I find it pretty weird that a guy who positions himself as the great Tolkien understander has a problem with stories that uplift the weak and lowly to make them heroes and saviors of civilization. What did he think the Lord of the Rings was doing?
My friends, you bow to no one.
What did he think the hobbits represented? What did he think Gollum, the final instrument of divine providence in the book version of Return of the King, symbolized? I also can't help thinking that he's doing more than a little projection here. You know the old canard that every conservative accusation is actually a confession? When progressives point out and explain the power relations of an unjust hierarchy, that's all they're doing, observing and reporting. It's not an expression of how we see morality. It's the political right that has historically advanced cynical morality. That's why so many of these clowns equate truth with strength, or masculinity with morals. They think everyone else bases their morality on raw power because that's what they do, and they can't conceive of anyone else actually thinking differently than that. The truth is that the moral worldview Disparu hates so much, the one that uplifts the weak and wants to overturn established hierarchies, is nothing new. It's actually baked into the Catholic faith that animated Tolkien and has sustained billions of other people across history. It finds its most pronounced modern expression in liberation theology, but some version of it has been a part of the Christian tradition from the very beginning. The first chapter of the Gospel of Luke opens with the Magnificat, or the Song of Mary, one of the most ancient Christian hymns, and it tells us of the Savior, "He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has stilled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty." That's Luke chapter 1, verses 52 to 53. To this day, in Western Christianity, the Magnificat is sung or recited during Vespers, the main evening prayer service. The association of righteousness with the uplifting of the weak and lowly is, in fact, a consistent theme throughout the Bible, and particularly the life and teachings of Jesus. It's all over the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. Even the epistles carry warnings for rich oppressors, like in James chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your riches have rotted, and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure during the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." I could go on. Entire books have been written on this theme. The point is that the Hollywood morality Disparu hates and considers to be the enemy of his masculine Christian values has been right there at the heart of the Christian tradition for thousands of years. This tension between that liberatory philosophy and the hierarchies that produce racism, misogyny, homophobia, and other forms of oppression is as old as Christendom itself. This is not a struggle between the West and barbarism, or between tradition and modernity. It's a dialogue that's been going on for as long as humans have organized themselves into societies. None of this is new, and it is a lie for Disparu to claim otherwise. Tolkien understood that the elevation of the lowly and the weak lay at the heart of his religious beliefs. He wasn't a crazy leftist, but he understood that much. That's why he made hobbits the protagonists of The Lord of the Rings. It's why he made Gollum the final instrument of God at the climax of the story. Tolkien's characters aren't heroic because they're strong or fierce or masculine. They're heroic because they're self-sacrificing, because they're humble, because they take pity even on their enemies. And if Disparu doesn't understand that, he doesn't understand Tolkien at all. But let me know what you think down in the comments. And until next time, remember that what's best in life is to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and engage in discourse with the women. Shanti, Salam, Shalom.